Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, I hope you're well, and with rehearsals just a matter of weeks away, welcome to episode 90 of this podcast series, and this time we're going to take a look at theatre ticket pricing and how it works.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
In the last episode, we were at the North Wall Arts Centre in Oxford for the first Pantomime panel event to discuss relaxed and accessible pantomime performance. If you missed it, you can still check it out, along with all of the other previous episodes. If you've missed them, so far we've had a variety of guests, from celebrities and backstage team members to practitioners and academics. We've discussed specific panto titles, talked about how pantomime is produced, its history and its future. So remember, you can check them all out where you normally get your podcasts from, and don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss any future episodes. Now this time, we're going to take a look in more detail at theatre finance from a producer and venue perspective, and how tickets are priced. As you book your theatre tickets for this panto season, you may well be asking yourself, why do they cost what they do? So I've been joined by Imagine Theatre's joint CEO, Sarah Boden, to answer that very question and to give you a real insight into how theatre ticket finance works. So first of all, Sarah, how are you?
Good, Martin. Lovely to catch up with you again.
I'm sure, like many things, we've all been and bought something and thought, well, why does that cost so much? Theatre tickets is a complicated business though, isn't it?
It really is, Martin. There are so many costs that people don't necessarily realise form part of their ticket price. And so when I sit down with people and I explain to them why it costs what it costs, it's almost like a light bulb goes on in their minds of, oh, I hadn't actually considered that at being part of a price. And so that's why we felt that it would be a great episode to do on the podcast of explaining to people why we have to charge what we do. And hopefully at the end of this episode, people will go, that makes a bit more sense now.
Yeah, so if we look at a theatre ticket in almost like a pie chart way, there are little chunks of that, and sometimes big chunks of that ticket price that will go off in all different directions. Let's talk first of all about the theatre and producer split, because if you're working with a venue, then obviously the money will be divided between you and the venue. How does that work?
Well, it comes down to each individual contract really, because it all depends upon the type of service you are providing. We're talking about pantomime specifically. Now you might put 6 in the cast, 8 in the cast, 12 in the cast, 15 in a cast. Depends. You might have to provide all the backstage crew, or the venue might provide the backstage crew. You might be able to use the venue infrastructure, or you might have to bring it all in yourself. There might be a full infrastructure backstage or not be there. There may be challenges with bringing certain sets into buildings. There's lots of things that sit behind a price. So we're dealing with 21 different productions this Christmas, and all 21 of them have a completely different financial deal. They have a completely different structure of ticket pricing and a completely different way that they work, because every venue is different. And that's the bit that people seem to forget. They can look at face value and look at a ticket price and go, that venue's cheaper than that. Why is that? Well, there might be a star name involved, there might not. So typically you can look at a percentage. Sometimes it's a guaranteed fee and a split. Sometimes it's a straight split. That split could be 65, 70, 75, 80, 85% to the producer, the remaining factor going to the venue. And again, all comes down to the deal you have with that venue and the amount of resource each side puts to the deal.
So if, let's say the deal was 50-50, which it never is, the 50% that the venue have, they will then have expenses, they will have staff to pay, they've got to use that money as well. And the 50% that you might get, likewise, you've got cast, musicians, all the other areas to actually spend that money on. So that's where it becomes really complicated, isn't it? Because as you say, a venue might provide its own staff, so the split will be different. If they don't have the staff, you provide them, and the split then becomes more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's it. And it can vary year on year as well, and those open dialogues that we have between theatres. So one year there might be a lighting designer in the staffing of the building who wants to have a go at lighting the panto. The following year that resource might have left the building and we have to provide it. So it's not just fixed throughout the contract. Sometimes it ebbs and flows during the contract as well. And those are the kind of conversations we have. But yeah, there's so many staff behind the scenes that you don't see. There's so many people backstage on the stage area itself. There can be anything up to 12 or 14 people backstage crew that you don't see on top of the people actually on the front of the stage, and then there's the front of house staff that the venue has to provide, and the bar staff, and the teams, the head office team for Imagine, and the team working in the theatre. There is so many hidden costs, but again, I'm sure we'll go into all of this in a moment, Martin.
No, absolutely. Let's talk about the actual performance side of it, because we'll look at cast, but obviously the backstage team as well. If they're provided by the producers, they've all got to be paid out of the money that comes from those individual tickets. And again, that size of cast and that size of backstage crew can be completely different wherever you go. And obviously the makeup of the cast is something you have to do very carefully, because the balance of payments is difficult if you have a star name in.
Well, it is, and ultimately the biggest thing that feeds that kind of decision is kind of the size of the auditorium. So if you're dealing with a 2,000 seater number one venue, that's going to be able to afford a very different scale of production or a very different scale of cast or crew to a venue that can only seat 500 people. So that underpins a lot of it. What is the ultimate gross take that venue can achieve? And then you start with that and you work backwards from there, and you work out the scale of the production you're able to put in. And when you've got the big number one venues with 2,000 seats selling a couple of £1 million worth of tickets, maybe even more, it's naturally going to be a very, very different picture and a different set of production values to your 300 seater venue that takes £250,000 gross. You have to shape it, and that's why one size can't fit all, because you can also end up with a 1,500 seat venue that actually, for Panto, only really has 750 saleable seats. So you're looking at the venue thinking, this is a really big venue, why isn't its production bigger? But the reality is that there's only a limited number of seats we can sell. So as a producer and as a venue, there's a lot of things we have to look at and a lot of factors that we have to look at that go into deciding all of that. When you actually
first budget for, say, a brand new venue, how do you come up with that sort of estimate, that estimate gross figure? Is it an 85%, a 90% house, for instance, for the run? How do you do it?
The difficult thing is when you start with a venue from scratch. So, for example, this year we're producing Panto in Fareham Live for the very first time, and Fareham Live was Fernham Halls and has been dark for 6 years. So we have no idea how we're going to do with those sales. We don't know whether we're looking at a gross take of £100,000 or £500,000. We genuinely don't know. So that one's a little bit trickier to kind of guesstimate. But the majority of the time, you'll have historical sales that you can start to work with. You'll know how many tickets that venue typically sells, what it typically grosses, what its ticket prices are, what its audience demand is, how many schools versus public tickets, and that will give you an indication. And you always start with the historical sales and where you are, and it's from that point that you build your potential budget and your potential take.
And a state-of-the-art brand new venue with an in-house team working backstage, is less of a challenge than, let's say, Panto in a circus tent in Scotland, because you literally have to provide everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, come on, it's Big Top Panto. It's going to be an interesting challenge this year, one that we're really looking forward to, really excited about the production that we're putting in there this year. But absolutely, that is, you kind of get extremes of we had Fareham Live being a brand new venue. We've then got a whole other raft of pantos that are established pantos in their rhythm. You then move on to somewhere like Kilmarnock, where we're putting Panto in a Big Top, actually selling really well and actually doing super well, because Kilmarnock's Panto is we've done Kilmarnock's Panto for 20 years in the Palace, so we've got an idea of what might go on up there. But yeah, absolutely, there's so many anomalous factors that are thrown at you. It might be that a local car park is closed as well, and these are the kind of things that all throw these factors up in the air, and you have to literally sit with a chart at the start of the year and go, right, what did we do last year? What's changing this year? What do we need to be aware of? And a big plan about each production.
We've spoken about some of the hidden costs in previous episodes. We've talked about chaperones, for instance, and children's licenses, but they all add to the overall budget of the show, don't they? So what other hidden costs are there?
So when you pay your ticket price, and you might pay £25 for your seat, £30 for your seat, the biggest thing that comes straight off the top is VAT. So the government will instantly take 20% off the top of that ticket price. If you were looking for simple maths, a £24 ticket, for example, instantly we have to give £4 over to the government, and that's That's a big chunk of money when you're looking at a gross box office take, and you have to take that off the top. There's usually booking fees from the venue as well, transaction fees, levies, and sometimes an inside commission. Sometimes that inside commission can be as much as 10%. And so while you as an audience member might pay £30 for the ticket, the truth is that the producer and the venue net that down to £20 before you start the split, and there's £10 just been taken off the top for the various activities that have to happen, like the VAT and the credit card. The credit card commissions are 3%, inside commissions vary, levies vary, typically £2.50, £3 a ticket, and suddenly, as a producer, you've seen a third of the ticket price just disappear off the top, and then you're starting the split on a much lower price. And it's that bit that when I explain that to people, they go, I had absolutely no idea that you were going to lose that amount off the top. Yeah. And it's not anybody being greedy. That's not what it's about. The truth is that there are booking fees and transaction fees and credit card commissions and VAT that we have to pay to various providers. It's not, nobody's being greedy. It's just making sure that the right fees are paid to the right people.
Any other licenses? Because apart from children's licenses, obviously there are copyright licenses in terms of PRS and, particularly, and we talk about Disney, being particularly expensive if you use Disney songs and so on, but that's another area that people don't realise. You have to pay for the right to use other people's music. Yeah,
you do. So your Performing Rights Society or your PRS fee has to come off what we call off the top of the box office, so it's taken off before any split is done. You can clear PRS in advance and you can get a reduced rate. Typically it's at 4.2%, but we do clear in advance or Pantomime reduce that down quite significantly. But again, that's a hefty fee that people don't realise. Mm-hmm. If you're going to do Peter Pan, the traditional version of Peter Pan as opposed to the new adventures of Peter Pan, that's a 5% of your entire box office goes to an agency on behalf of Great Ormond Street. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing Peter Pan, that's a super expensive production to do. Writers' fees, designers' fees, all of those kind of things, things just gently eat into what is there.
And I mean, just staying with Peter Pan for a second, the flying itself is very expensive, isn't it?
It's tens of thousands of pounds. And again, this is what people don't necessarily realise, is to hire a Peter Pan flying rig for a 3-week panto run could be £15,000. Mm-hmm. And that's just for that short effect of Peter flying. But it's an essential part of the show. So Peter Pan comes with a flying rig and your Great Ormond Street royalties, and before you know it, that's really mounted up.
So already we've seen just how much is being taken away from the ticket price already. People may come and see a show and think, well, not many people in this show, it can't cost that much. But let's talk about the other hidden extras in terms of staff, because the whole of the Imagine headquarters team, for instance, but then obviously you've got music composers and band who may go in and pre-record music and so on. That list is endless in itself.
Well, it is, and it takes an army to put on a pantomime. It takes a village in every single production, and they form an army. This is the bit that people don't see. So back at Imagine head office, there are 30 of us. Most of us for full-time, but there are some part-time workers. And those 30 people spend all year preparing our pantos and our panto hires. So we're working on 21 productions plus an additional 20 hires this year. So that's pretty busy. Of those people, we've got some in senior management, in operations, in production, in wardrobe, in costuming. It's all sorts of different roles that they play. Children's licensing, contracting, full-time person just contracting people, for example, full-time person just licensing the children. These are the bits that people don't realise, all the legalities that have to sit behind it. And if we don't do all that properly, then we're not complying with all the employment laws that we have to comply with. We have to still meet minimum wage requirements like everybody else, and we have to make sure we tick the legal boxes as much as anything when we're doing what we're doing. And that's the bit people don't see. They don't realise that we have to run a building that stores all the scenery and the costumes and the props. We have to ship those around the country. We have to make sure that they're delivered at the right times. We have to repair them, maintain them, clean them, and that's quite a hefty operation.
Yep, well, transport alone is something I was going to mention, because for any one of your shows, the sets, the costumes, all the other stuff that goes with any show has to be transported to the venue and then transported back to the unit every year. these are all incidental costs that are not tiny costs, are they?
Well, no. If you take, for example, that we're shipping a set to Inverness from Coventry, that's the furthest distance that we travel, there will be a lorry that goes to Inverness or to any of our venues at the very start of rehearsals that contains costumes and props. That's lorry number one. Then there'll be another lorry, typically an articulated lorry, sometimes two, that travels from Coventry and our stores to the location of the venue. And incidentally, we've just recently changed our lorry providers, so we're now carbon neutral on our lorries because we have HVO fueled lorries. And then at the end, everything has to come back, and normally it takes either one or two articulated lorries to bring everything back. But on top of all of that, we also hire lighting and sound, and they have to be collected from the various points in the UK where they are, brought to Coventry, put on the lorries, and then when they come back to Coventry they have to be returned. So there are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles worth of lorry driving that goes on. Thankfully we are reducing our carbon footprint very heavily on all of that, but it costs a lot of money. I think last year, combined with our hires, we spent £250,000 on transport. It's huge amounts of money.
And obviously headquarters, which is where everything is based pretty much, sets, costumes, the team work from there as well. There are overheads involved with that as well.
Absolutely, just like any business. I say to everybody, they go, gosh, you've got the best job in the world. And I go, do you know what, I really have. And I'm incredibly lucky to have a job that I love. But I still have to keep the HMRC happy and the councils happy and employment law happy and all of those rules and regulations that we have to keep. For example, anybody that's living more than 25 miles away from home, under equity requirements, we have to pay them a subsistence payment. It's £200 and something a week they get. Every single person gets that subsistence if they're not living at home. All of this is written into employment law and into our equity guidelines from our union. And it's really important that we comply with all of that. But this is the bit that people don't see. They don't see those hidden costs. They don't realise that actually the people that are putting the show on behind the scenes, we've got to pay them. Yeah. We've got to keep them warm in the winter when they're at work. We've got to give them a safe environment to work in. We've got to store the sets. I mean, our store is enormous, and we're just about to get a second store because we've got so much kit. That takes a lot of storage and a lot of floor space. Each pantomime set, yes, we can flat pack, as we've talked about before in this podcast. You can flat pack a pantomime set, but it ain't going to go down that small.
Okay, so you're spending all this money, you want to make sure that the show actually sells, so then marketing comes in, and that is a big chunk, isn't it?
Well, marketing's an enormous chunk, yeah. I mean, again, as you've said, if you don't sell it and you don't tell people it's on, they won't come. So marketing is an absolutely critical part of our team. We have two pretty much full-time marketeers, plus myself supporting them, plus other peripheral team members that are working within the marketing department. And then we have budgets in each show, and it's paying for out-of-house media and photo shoots and print and design work and radio adverts, and there's just so much. And again, I remember talking to someone a few years ago, and they said to me, well, why did that billboard only stay up for a fortnight? Why didn't it stay up for the whole duration of our rehearsals and our run? And I said to them, well, how much do you think a billboard is for a fortnight? And he was like, about £100. I was like, well, maybe more like £600 a fortnight, plus the poster production, plus getting the poster up on the billboard, and then start timing that by the number of billboards we do across the season. And it's tens and tens of thousands of pounds worth of just out-of-home billboard provision. And people are really blown away when you explain genuinely how much it really costs.
Yeah, so the hidden cost is the thing that people never actually think about when they come and see a show, isn't it? So once you've broken it all down into all those different areas, you get a better understanding of just how challenging it is, particularly after COVID. And I know that you receive government grants, but there may be some venues, for instance, that are still having to pay back the government COVID support loans as well. So there may be extra challenges for them.
Yes, absolutely. And also the bit we haven't talked about really is the investment that you initially make in each production as well. So that production that you're watching in Panto has to be built initially, and it has to have its set, its costumes, and all of its infrastructure built. And again, it's very likely that certain venues have taken out loans and things like that. before they're able to pay for it. And again, then there's hidden interest costs that you're not aware of. There's all these research development costs sitting behind that production, and they don't recoup in a year. They can take tens of years to recoup some of these productions.
And maintenance, I mean, we've talked about this on previous podcasts as well, because people might think, again, you get your costumes out for Christmas, or you get your sets out for Christmas and just reuse them. That's not easy, is it? Because they have to be maintained to start with sets. So that means bringing in scenic artists and so on, all these extra costs.
Well, it does, and it's just like anything, that when you move something, it will get scuffed or it will get damaged. So you can have a brand new set built, and it might come out the workshop, and before it's even arrived at the theatre, because it's had to be transported on a lorry, it can get scuffed and damaged, and we've got to do a paint call on it, even though it's brand new. And then you move that set back into the stores, and it gets damaged, and it needs repainting, or it needs re-glittering because something's been scuffed and the glitter's come off it, or you need to repair a hole, because sometimes these things happen, that when things come back to us, something's got caught and it's damaged a piece of canvas, and that's the bit again that people don't see. We've got 2 full-time staff at Imagine just repairing the cloths and the sets and things like that. We've got a full-timer doing all the props. And we've got 6 full-timers looking after the costumes, and that's just the maintenance and the repairs and the wear and tear. And it doesn't matter how you look after stuff, transporting things and using things and wearing them on a day-to-day basis during productions will cause damage, it will cause dirt, and it will need a repair.
You do all the research, you put your budgets together, you budget the show, its cast, and then you come to the panto season, and inevitably there will always be a risk involved. So what's the feeling when you go into that panto run and you're thinking, we need to sell this number of tickets to break even, and you know, that sort of pressure builds?
Yeah, I would say to people that there's one ticket each panto season, which is the difference between losing money and making money. And literally, it's almost like a massive seesaw, that you are losing money all the way up till you sell that one individual ticket. And from the moment you sell that one ticket, it's never profit, it's always a contribution to the overheads of the business and to the further costs. But that one ticket is your seesaw between a loss-making show and a potential profit-making show, because again, there's always contingencies and there's always secret costs that you weren't expecting that jump up and bite you, like if it snows and we have to put the cast in a hotel because they can't get home. It's these kind of costs that jump up and bite you that you weren't expecting. But yeah, it is literally one ticket that makes all the difference. And how do you feel about it? Well, we track the sales all year round, so we know what's happening. Each week on week there is a weekly sales report about each production, so we know how it's tracking versus the year before and the year before that, and we know whether it's doing what we want. We know whether the ticket yield is where we're expecting it to be. We know what the marketing team is delivering. Squeaky moments, but at the same time, it's calculated risk, I think, is what I'd say.
And with those unexpected costs, you know, the snow scenario and other things like that, how do you manage that? Do you have an insurance pot, a fund that you've got to break into if anything extra is needed? Yeah,
absolutely. There's a contingency pot on every production. There has to be. It can be all sorts of things like extra transport costs. One of the Imagine team's got to go back to that production that we weren't expecting a second visit on, so there's additional travel costs that are involved in that. All sorts of reasons why. Yes, a contingency pot. And typically our contingency pot sits around 2% of production cost, and I think our overall contingency pot for the season is best part of £200,000 on contingency, which sounds like an awful lot of money, but when you're doing 21 shows all at the same time, it's actually surprising how quickly you eat into that.
And of course, most of the shows will actually get bigger and bigger in terms of the following as they grow in new venues. People might come and see the show to see what your pantos are like, and then they love it, so they'll come back, and then more people will come each year. Is that another opportunity to reinvest and invest perhaps more in the future? Yeah,
it is, and it's always the fine balance of investment, because obviously it's what we don't do is the same infrastructure doesn't return back to the venue year on year. Each venue will only have that infrastructure once, so we have multiple sets for Cinderella, multiple sets for Beauty and the Beast, multiple sets for Jack and the Beanstalk. So as the cycles go around each production, we don't repeat the same infrastructure. So investment is always a fine balance. You've got to know that you've got a future use in multiple venues to allow you to invest in that. But yeah, absolutely, year on year, you try and better yourself year on year. You try and improve on year. And that's easier said than done sometimes, because there might be a reason why you've got less to spend on the show, you've got more to spend on the show. There's all sorts of things, again, that only producers kind of would understand. But year on year, our investment pot across our portfolio of pantos is quite hefty.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of these things will stay the same each year, but every show is different and will have different demands. Peter Pan with the flying we mentioned, for instance, there are going to be expenses that vary across show from show. Yeah,
and that's the bit that, again, we people are always blown away when we explain the different scenarios, and it's things like, the low smoke machines for Cinderella's flying carriage that cost a lot of money, or flying machine sequences in Sleeping Beauty for the time machine, and then a director might come up with a crazy suggestion, like last year Justin Fletcher and Steve came up with the idea of having a Portaloo in Reading, and not only did we have to get a Portaloo, but we had to turn that Portaloo into some kind of time machine and make all the adaptations on that. And those are the kind of things as well that people don't realise are additional new props that we're putting into each production that may not have existed before. And we do happen to know that the Portaloo is being used again this year somewhere else, but it could have been that was just a one-off thing. I remember when we worked with Tim Vine and in Croydon in 2019, his opening gag was he came in a flying courgette, which was a brilliant gag and incredibly funny. Costs quite a bit to build, and it's never been used again. So it's again assessing the sustainability of a prop if you're going to invest in it. So Panto is pretty much the ultimate sustainable business, that we reuse things year on year. Are we going to get a return on that investment? Is it worth the cost of storing it year on year as well? Because the storage comes with a cost. You can't just get something and not, you've got to put it somewhere and you've got to store it.
And I guess a lot of people might think digital sets might be cheaper than regular sets, or digital sets might be more expensive. It's a different sort of expense, because there may be different sort of costs with something like that than a traditional physical set.
Absolutely. So in the digital productions, for example, the maintenance of the LED tape and making sure that the LED structures work okay, that's the kind of thing that people wouldn't think about, that we have to check all the lighting and the whole set has to be pat tested every year, whereas a traditional set, we don't have to deal with that, we're just repainting it. They take up surprisingly more space than you think, the digital productions, mainly because they all come with their own flooring. So they all travel with their own MDF floor, and all that has to be stored. And we're storing many Panto floors in the unit in Coventry as well, which again, people wouldn't appreciate that we lay a false floor in most venues.
No. So as the company's grown over the years, how many more spreadsheets do you have now, Sarah, than you did maybe 10 years ago?
Oh, Martin, there's so many spreadsheets. And because every venue has to have a technical overview schedule, so you're working out the tech schedule, has to have a children's chaperoning schedule, a performance schedule. There's so much that goes behind it. We said about chaperones, all the children in the productions have to be chaperoned. Those chaperones all have to have their DBS licenses, their chaperone licenses, their Disclosure Scotland, PVGs. We have to pay the chaperones. We have to make sure we've got a head chaperone that manages everything. And again, you wouldn't appreciate that. And we try and get all the children to be able to share a costume because that's realistically affordable. But naturally, we're not going to be able to find 8 perfect matches with 2 teams or 3 teams of 8 that are going to perfectly match. So there's always those alterations to the costumes and things like that. Again, all of this in 32 pairs of shoes for the children, for example, and then the director says, "Oh, I don't like the gold walk down shoes. Can I have silver?" And then we have to go out and buy all new shoes because a change of colour of that's. And we actually haven't talked about production teams really, Martin, either, have we? So obviously, each production has its own production team: a director, a choreographer, sometimes a fight director, a musical director, and they will individually work on that show for quite some time. So our directors are typically, put into place April, May, and they work all year on the production. Again, so that comes with a cost as well that we have to think about. Yeah. They'll typically be housed in a hotel during production week, and we have to make sure that they're local if they're not living local, and production meetings and things. Again, all these things are things that people go, "Oh yeah, of course you'll have a director. I hadn't thought about that." They forget it's not just the people you see on stage.
music alone and the cost of production of music, live bands if you have them, all that adds to all the expense. One thing's for sure, there is no one size fits all budget for a venue and a show, is there?
No, and completely for music. Your music will vary. So there's a couple of venues that we do that we don't have live bands because there just isn't the space for the bands. We don't have the capacity for the live pit, right the way through to some venues where we have 5 in the pit. And you can look at a very different swinging scale of cost. Tens of thousands of pounds to put music in the show, and as we've touched upon with the PRS clearances, but also we have to do all the tracks behind the scenes, all the musical arrangements and the click tracks to fill out the sound and to make it sound like a big production, because the days of 10 or 12 in the pit in the old heady 60s, 70s, 80s, they're just not here anymore. So we have to make sure that the production is affordable, and I think that's the big thing about ticket pricing. When we're setting ticket pricing, we consider all of these factors that we've been talking about, but ultimately we have to sit back and go, can families in the area afford that ticket? And if the answer is no, and we're too expensive, we have to cut the cloth. Steve and I, we're a family too. We have a daughter. We understand the financial pressures that families are under, and so quite often we'll sort of look at ourselves and go, could we afford that? Is that a ticket price we're prepared to pay for that product? And if the answer is no, then let's reset and restart.
Yeah, and of course Christmas is a challenging time financially for families anyway, isn't it?
Oh gosh, absolutely. There's so many demands on families' times. Light trails and Christmas parties and going out for a Christmas dinner and all of these kind of things that everybody wants to make the most of Christmas. And so we'd never take it for granted that people spend their Christmas money with us and with the venue that we're producing, and we're always hugely grateful, and we're always mindful of making sure the product that we put on stage is what they want to see. It would be really remiss of us to charge a fortune for a product that nobody wanted to see. Yeah. So the feedback that we get at the end of each production is really valuable, and we really, really listen to it. Because if there's a common theme to say, we really liked this performer, we really liked this sequence, we don't like that, we do like that, we listen to that. So, sometimes you might put a 12 Days of Christmas sequence in and then take it out for 1 year. Yeah. And sometimes you'll get no reaction at all. Other times you'll get, where was 12 Days of Christmas? Yeah. And then if we get that reaction, it goes straight back in again the following year. So we genuinely do listen to that feedback.
Well, look, it's been a fascinating insight, and we really have only scratched the surface in many ways, haven't we? But Sarah, thank you so much for talking to us.
You're welcome, Martin. And as I say, I hope it's just been a little bit interesting and a bit of an insight. Thank you so much for your time.
And that's it for now. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a look at the role of the choreographer in the Panto team. So please remember to subscribe through your favourite podcast app and join me, Martin Ballard, next time for episode 91.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.